All right. Hello, 6th grade. Welcome to day 2 of week 2 of online learning. So, in the last lesson yesterday, we didn't get quite as far as I was hoping. And so today what we're going to do is finish up that lesson and move on to our next thing about elements of nonfiction. The last part of this lesson I wanted to go over was organization and how nonfiction writers organize their writing. I want to start out with a question for you. I'd like you to tell me, are you usually someone who's organized or unorganized? This isn't a graded question, so don't worry. I'm usually someone who tries to be more organized, though you don't always have time for it, and that's okay. Alright, let's talk a little bit about what organization does for us. If we're organized, then life can be easier to understand and deal with. This guy over here on the left, he is not very organized. He has post-it notes right on his face, which I have to tell you is not a great place for post-it notes. He's got his papers all over the place. It probably will take him a while to find whatever he needs to, and he's probably going to get stabbed a little bit with his pen, which is poking up right here. This guy on the right, he's got all of his stuff in some sort of order up here. He's got his inbox with his papers. He's got all of his pens facing down, and his post-it notes are on the wall, which, once again, this is a little bit of a better spot than the face. I would rather live my life kind of like this guy, where I know where everything is, and I don't have to stress out all the time. If our writing is organized, then it can be easier to understand as well. And so when nonfiction writers create their pieces, they try to think of different ways in which they can organize their information so that it makes the most sense to us and so that we can understand it. There are a few different types I want to go over. Nonfiction writers tend to organize their pieces of writing in 5 main ways. Now, this is just a quick little overview. We are going to talk more about this in 7th grade, but I want to give you guys an idea of what nonfiction writers like to do. So the first way is chronological. This is where the events are written in the order that they happen. The second is spatial. This is where the writer will describe items as they appear in space. Now, space doesn't refer to outer space. It means like the space around you. Alright, cause and effect. The causes and effects of events or items are described. So the author might write something like, when the light switches up, then the light bulb turns on. That's a very simple example of cause and effect. Compare and contrast is when 2 or more things are compared, or contrasted. So comparing is technically when we talk about the similarities between 2 things. Contrasting is when we talk about the differences. And problem and solution is where a solution for a problem is described. If the problem is that the car is broken, then the solution is that we fix it with a wrench or some other tool. Some examples of each of these I want to explain right now. So, news articles are a great example of chronological organization because in news articles they tell you the story in the order that it happened in. They give you, the beginning of the story, the middle, and the end. An example of spatial nonfiction writing is photo captions. So if you've ever seen a picture of a group of people, it'll probably say from left to right, and then list off all these names. And that is one way the nonfiction writers describe what something looks like in space. Okay, an example of cause and effect writing you'll find a lot in history books. So history authors use this all the time to organize their writing. They'll maybe say, because the British were unfairly taxing the American colonies, then the Americans decided to revolt, and the revolution was begun. This is a great example of a history writer using cause and effect. Alright, compare and contrast. You see this a lot in science books. Science books will tell you the difference between a frog and a toad, or an alligator and a crocodile, or heat and cold. Lastly, problem and solution. An example for this one, instruction manuals. If you've ever had a problem with a computer or a device or a video game and you've had to look up the solution to that, you have looked at an instruction manual of sorts. It describes an issue and then gives you the solution for how to solve that. Alright, so we've wrapped up this lesson right here. Now we're going to move on to our lesson for our main lesson for today. Right, so for our main lesson today, we're talking about the purposes of nonfiction. So, the reasons why an author writes something. There are three main purposes of nonfiction. There is the purpose of wanting to inform, the purpose of wanting to describe, and the purpose of wanting to persuade. Now, let's unpack each of these. But before we do that, let's talk about this. A little bit ago, we talked about the different types of nonfiction. Types and purposes are two different things, so I don't want you to get those mixed up. But every piece of nonfiction is some sort of combination of those two. So we've got the types over here: informative nonfiction, narrative nonfiction, and literary nonfiction. Remember, informative is when a piece of nonfiction is just giving us information. Narrative is when it tells us a story, and literary is when it tells usually a story with some creative use of language that we would probably often see in a piece of fiction. Now, the purposes which we are talking about today, to inform, to describe, and persuade, those are what motivates the author to write. So this is the type of nonfiction that they use to achieve their purpose. So let me give you an example. If the author is going to use an informative piece of text, then their purpose for doing so might be to describe something. So an author wants to describe, say, a jellyfish. They decide, okay, the best way for me to describe a jellyfish is just to write a little informative article that gives out info on a jellyfish. Let's do another example. Let's say an author wants to persuade you to do something. They want to persuade you to go adopt a cat, perhaps. And so they're going to tell you a little story, a piece of narrative nonfiction, about how when they adopted a cat, it changed their life. So we start out with a motivation, a purpose, to inform, describe, or persuade. But then, in order to carry out that purpose, we have to choose a different type of nonfiction: informative, narrative, or literary. Alright, let's move on. So, let's talk specifically about the purpose of informing. If an author's purpose is to inform, then they are going to give us facts in a few ways. They might list out the facts, or they might tell a story with the facts. They will not be giving their opinions, though, so keep that in mind. When an author is informing you about something, they're not really giving you their opinions. Here's an example. Jellyfish are part of a group of animals referred to as cnidarians. Jellyfish do not have brains in the same way other animals do. Instead, they have only basic nervous systems. Jellyfish do not use electricity to sting those who come into contact with their tentacles. They use microscopic cells which fire tiny hooks. This is true information, and when I was younger I was very interested in jellyfish, and still am today. And so this was some interesting stuff I learned about them when I did, I think, an 8th grade research project. Now notice, I didn't put my opinion in here, so this is just me giving you some facts. Alright, let's talk about describing. Now, if an author's purpose is to describe, they're going to represent a person, place, thing, or idea in words. So they're going to take a look at the person, place, thing, or idea, and they are going to represent it with their words. They might explain what it looks like. They might explain how it acts. I want to tell you right now, though, informing and describing are almost exactly the same. And so for the purposes of this lesson, we're going to kind of count them as the same thing. But let me give you an example of what description looks like. So, the moon jellyfish is mostly transparent, which allows one to see its internal organs. In the center of its bell is a brightly colored 4-leaf clover design. Small translucent tentacles trail behind it. The edge of its bell has a fringe of small, fine tentacles. Okay, so we have a picture right here of a moon jellyfish, one of my favorite jellyfish. But what I did over here is I represented everything we see in words, or at least most of what we see. Okay. Lastly, we're going to talk about persuading. If an author's purpose is to persuade you of something. So if their purpose is to persuade, then they're going to state their opinion. Remember, in informing and describing, we don't want the opinion, but in persuading, we absolutely do want the opinion. Then they're going to back it up with evidence. And lastly, they may encourage the reader to do something or believe something. Here's an example. Jellyfish are the most wonderful animals on this big, beautiful planet. Jellyfish look beautiful, are not capable of evil because they have no brains, and have a very fun name. You should make jellyfish your favorite animal. So this is a case where the author is telling you something they believe. Jellyfish are the most wonderful animals. Then they back it up with a few facts, or a few points, I suppose. They look beautiful, they're not capable of evil, they have a fun name. And then lastly, the author tries to convince you or urges you to do something. And what they urge you to do is make jellyfish your favorite animal. I have to admit, I agree with all of this stuff right here. I love jellyfish, and you should definitely make them your favorite animal. All right. Okay, let's talk about practice and how you can show me that you kind of understand what we're talking about here. Here is a paragraph. I would like you to read this and tell me if this is, if the purpose of this writing is to inform/describe, or if it's to persuade. All right, let's move on to our next one. I would like you to tell me if this piece of nonfiction is written to inform or describe, inform/describe, or if it's written to persuade. Alright, by the way, I would pause this video right now, go to YouTube, and look up a slow-mo video of dogs drinking water, and you'll kind of understand what this means. I thought it was a very cool fact when I first learned about it. Okay, go ahead and read this paragraph and tell me, is the author trying to inform/describe, or are they trying to persuade you of something? Alright, our last one for today. Go ahead and read this piece of information, this piece of nonfiction, and tell me, is the author trying to inform/describe, or are they trying to persuade? Alright, excellent work with all of this, 6th grade. Now, I'm going to leave you with a few words before we finish up this lesson. I think it's very important for us to know the author's purpose, because if we know what they're trying to do, we can be in the right state of mind. For instance, if I know that the author just wants to teach me about jellyfish, then I can get ready to learn. But if I know the author is going to try to convince me to make jellyfish my favorite animal, then I will be alert and be ready to look at their facts and decide if they're good facts, look at their sources, decide if they're good sources, and look at their points and decide if that really is going to affect how I think. If we don't really think about the purpose that the author has, then we might go into an article or a piece of nonfiction and sort of get hoodwinked, or sort of just assume that everything we read is true. It's important as we read in this world to be aware that people don't always have the best intentions and don't always tell us the truth. And so it's important for us to make sure that we are ready to sort of combat that and think critically. Alright, thank you for joining me today, 6th grade. I will see you tomorrow, or talk to you tomorrow.